Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'm really excited to go over the presentation that we have for you and answer a lot of questions. We'll maybe give folks another 30 seconds or so to file in here. And in the meantime, we can go through a quick couple introductions with myself and my two co-hosts here. I'm Nick Halverson, CEO, founder of Workspaces, and I'll throw it over to you, Julie.
Hi, I am Julie Levick, a principal and strategist with Bureau Happel Advisory.
And I'm Elliot Felix. I'm a partner at Bureau Happold, and I lead the higher education sector for our advisory practice.
Awesome. Thank you both. Thank you, Bureau Happold, for working together with Workspaces on this webinar, the webinar we had a couple weeks ago as well. I am really excited for this one that's focused on data, trends, strategies, and real processes of how to implement change for campus workspaces. So with that kind of background, Elliot, I'll throw it over to you to kind of walk us through the agenda for the session.
Excellent. And are you sure we shouldn't just like collect a bunch of data and then not do anything with it?
Yeah, I'm sure.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, yeah, I didn't think that was a good idea either. So let's talk about what the data is and what you can actually do with it. And in this session, we'll introduce ourselves. We'll talk a little bit about the data we used for this multi-campus study and some case studies since. We'll make the case for workplace change on campuses. We'll talk through the process of workplace change, and then we'll leave lots of time for discussion. And of course, ask questions in the comments throughout. Some of them we'll address in real time. Others we might wait a few minutes. You know, for instance, if we've got a slide or some data or some hot graph to speak to it. But we're really excited with your comments. The last session we did that was focused on other campus spaces had lots of interaction and lots of great questions, and we expect nothing less today to make this worthwhile for you. As I mentioned, I'm a partner at Bureau Happold, and I lead our higher ed advisory practice. We're a global engineering and consulting firm on a mission to really transform people's experiences in space, and they could be employees at work, students, researchers, travelers, fans, understanding their needs, improving the spaces and how they're operated, and how the organization changes altogether. And we've worked with 120 colleges and universities, everyone a little bit different, everyone a bit of a special snowflake, but with a lot of the same common challenges and data that can help make better decisions and improve how people live, learn, and work.
And a little bit of background on Workspaces. I started Workspaces 6 years ago. I was a student at UC San Diego. I hated how crowded my library was, so I was an electrical engineer. I said, I'm going to make a sensor that counts how many people are on every floor of the library, so as a student I can see it in real time and I don't have to waste time going up and down 8 floors of the building. I did this project with my co-founder while we were in school. We released this app on campus, and then all the real estate folks immediately, like 2 weeks after we released the app and it went viral amongst the students, the real estate teams called me up and said, how can we get this data in our office spaces? as well. And that's really when OcuSpace became a real custom or a real company. And not too long after that, I met Elliot at like the first conference I ever went to, and he's been a big mentor and a help over the whole lifetime of OcuSpace as well. We really have a vision to kind of bring the power of web analytics to the physical world. And by capturing data on how spaces are being used, I feel like you can really transform the way spaces are designed, the way spaces are managed, and the experience of visitors to that space by actually getting a real feedback loop on how they're being used. So I'll set the stage a little bit on what is the data that we collect and how do we do it. The data we collect here, you can see a floor plan example. OcuSpace measures Bluetooth and Wi-Fi signal data in a space. We break a floor plan up into 1 to maybe 3 different big zones, we call it, that are kind of like neighborhoods. And in those zones, we measure the daily visitors of that space, kind of like a traffic count, a door counter, how many people go into this space a day. If you leave and come back, it's 2 different visits. And then there's occupancy. That's really the first metric we came out with. That's what most people use in most of their decisions, which is just how many people are in this space every minute of the day. And you can aggregate it up to the hour, to the day. And you can see in the pink zone, maybe there's 10 people on average there throughout the day, and different for the green and the orange zone. Now in July, we're coming out with dwell time, which is how long people spend in these spaces on average, something I'm really excited for. I really think it's going to tell a lot about what is the experience in these spaces, what are people trying to do in these spaces. A space with an average occupancy of 20 people, but a dwell time of 15 minutes versus a dwell time of 2 hours is very different in how you would design that space. And then finally, at the end of the year, we'll be coming out with heat maps as well. Let's touch on how it actually works. How do we capture this data? And most importantly, how do we do it in a privacy safe way? That was really the focus from the ground up, because I started this company as a student and it was being used in spaces I was going to. I said, this has to be privacy focused from the ground up in how we build this. We're not going to use cameras. We're not going to use like Wi-Fi log data from routers that are going to give you personally identifiable information. And we landed on this design that's a sensor that looks like this. It plugs right into an outlet with some adhesive that sticks on each side, covers about 2,500 square feet of space with one sensor. And we look at all the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi signal data from phones, laptops, iPads, watches, headphones. And what OcuSpace does better than anybody else in the world is it normalizes that signal data to a people estimation with 90 to 95% accuracy. And we do it all without storing, using any PII. We're fully GDPR compliant. We don't report data at the individual desk level. It's more at that neighborhood level you saw on the previous floor plan. And we never and can never actually tell who is in a space. And we've built our system from the ground up to make sure that you can get the right granularity of data with the right accuracy without the privacy downsides. And so wanted to set the stage a little bit on the data and how it works. And I'll hand it back over to the Borough-Happold folks to walk through some of the trends and insights we've seen.
Great. Thanks so much, Nick. So for the data sources, so OcuSpace provided us with a large amount of data from over 38 universities. And we were able to sort that into pre and post-pandemic. And we were able to then analyze this data and start to really identify a lot of different patterns that we were seeing that were common amongst universities, as well as some individual items that we noticed from each of the universities. So we really started collecting this data in 2023. The data spans 2019 through 2023. And that now we've seen even a greater increase in the amount of data that's being generated through OcuSpace. They work with over 77 universities. They have increased their office space data gathering by over 5 times. So I think that this is an important methodology to collect and harvest data, and it's continuing to grow at a quite a quick pace. So the data content, again, we were looking for different patterns to understand space use, to inform future facilities planning and decisions. So, the pandemic impact on university space utilization was obviously quite great. So we were able to look at the utilization before and after the pandemic. We looked at weekly space utilization patterns, daily, and then we began to identify the trends. So in terms of office space, what we're really looking at is, understanding how the office space is being used, what are the utilization trends, and what are kind of the characters that are coming out of the office space use. So looking at the period of data that we analyzed, again, starting in 2019 and then through 2023, certainly looking forward to an additional study, knowing that we've had a lot more people implementing this technology. Many of the universities were just starting to kind of implement this technology. So you can see on the left that the data wasn't available for certain types. So when we originally looked at this study, we identified office, gym, library, and food service as the space types that we were going to look at and analyze. But now you can see, moving into 2023, that the data is a lot more readily available. And that's really kind of the period that we'll be focusing on in this discussion today. So the case for campus workplace change.
Thanks, Julie. So we've talked about the data we used, how it's gathered, how it protects privacy. And now what we want to do is really think about how we can help you make the case for workplace change on your campus. And I think to start that and make that case as useful as possible for you, we want to get a sense of what arguments you're trying to make, or what case you're trying to make, or where you might be looking for data. So type a comment, and you can just type the number, or if you want to type out the word in bold, that's great too. But tell us a little bit about the office space decisions you're hoping to make with occupancy data. Is it about measuring the actual utilization? Is it about creating employee work styles for hybrid work? Is it reducing or right sizing the offices or desks? Is it about shifting to unassigned spaces, consolidating to free up space, understanding your change readiness, facilitating change management, other ways to enhance the employee experience? So type in a comment. Thank you, Amber, for the first out of the gate, shifting to unassigned spaces. So how do you use data to help you make that? Working from home. Thanks, Robert. Consolidating units to free up space. Yeah, that's pretty common. I think a lot of people have realized, okay, people are working as they will be. If we change our standards, how do we not end up with like pockets of unused space? 5 empty desks here and 3 here and 4 there. How do you consolidate folks to then get a usable chunk of space that you can reapply to grow in space or reallocate? A lot of folks interested in measuring the utilization in order to shift how they allocate it, increasing or optimizing the utilization, consolidating units. But it's interesting, like it seems like of these 8 things, we're all doing some mix of them. 1, 4, and 5 maybe seem to be the common denominator. First, you have to measure in order to then shift what you do and consolidate folks.
Keith has his hands full. He says he's doing 1 through 8.
Yeah. all of the above. It's like going to a restaurant, looking at the menu and saying, I'll take it. Excellent. So let's talk a little bit about how we, and again, keep thinking about your questions. Type those in the comments as well. And we'll talk a little bit about how we can help you make that change. And I think as we see all these changes, we know people are looking for more flexibility. And there's at least 2 dimensions of this, organizational flexibility and space flexibility. So, and sometimes these things get intertwined or convoluted or mixed up. Organizational flexibility might grant someone the ability to, or the opportunity to work different hours, 4/10s, or work in the evenings, or whatever it might be. And that's kind of your organization flexing to enable you to work in new ways. But there's also space flexibility, right, where our spaces fixed, where they're assigned to one person, or are they shared among different people and booked? And so when both of those are working together, you might have, a distributed work somewhere in the middle, you might have an activity-based workplace where people can choose when and where and how they work, and to some extent who they work with. And then the most fixed, the least flexible, right, is where you're assuming everyone's there 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, which feels pretty outdated at this point. And as people make these changes from that outdated model, it's kind of the same set of ideas that diffuse across industries, right? Like what consulting and professional services was doing 20, 30 years ago is now hitting higher ed, and kind of in waves. 3 big changes: moving to smaller individual spaces, compact offices in order to have more collaboration space, right? So smaller offices, more meeting rooms to simplify. Another big change is moving to more open environments. And then perhaps the biggest change of all is not assigning space to a people, but maybe assigning them to a neighborhood where they can choose a variety of different places: a phone booth, a kitchen table, a meeting room, a desk, a heads down space, a desk in a quiet area. And our sense is these ideas, they hit kind of staff first, and then they may hit part-time faculty, and then they hit full-time faculty. So the upper right corner is maybe the hardest change to make, and maybe one of the reasons there's very few examples of full-time faculty working in free address, unassigned, flexible space. But we know that with that flexibility and with these changes in how people work, that impacts utilization and occupancy. And one of the interesting things we found from this white paper, looking at all these different universities, is at the time of our analysis, going through really the beginning of this year, we were about at the pre-pandemic peak, but that peak is only 55%. So if you think about all the seats that are available in a workspace, that would be otherwise assigned to someone, at peak, we're only hitting 55%. So there's probably excess capacity. And it is cyclical, because even since then, if we go more granular, the peak, when you look at the deep red here, is 42%. And as you know, it varies by day and it varies by hour, with the Monday and the Friday kind of ghost town, lots of people coming into to empty offices, or not coming in at all. And so we know that the workspace isn't being used even at its peak nearly as much as it perhaps could be, which maybe means you don't need as much, or maybe it's not very good, or some combination of the two. But we also know it's not used as much as other sectors, and we can benchmark this against Nick Bloom, Stanford economist, who's been the work from home guru for, I think, well over a decade. He's a great follow on LinkedIn, and has been surveying folks throughout the pandemic. You see the gray line there at roughly 2/3 occupancy, higher ed running, in other sectors, higher ed running well below that. And so given that, we know lots of our clients, other universities writ large, are looking to rebalance supply of space with the demand of people, and what they're looking for and asking for. And I think trying to better match up how much space is supplied with how often people are coming in, and why they're coming in, and what they need to do. One mark of this is some benchmarking that we do on behalf of SCUP, the Society for College and University Planning, where in about 100 universities answering the survey, 77% plan to create flexible unassigned workspaces for staff in the next year. 60% said they plan to do that for faculty. I'm assuming that's pretty optimistic, and maybe is focused more on the part-time faculty, as we talked about. But office space is typically the largest non-residential space. It's about 20% of the average university portfolio, 50 to 75 square feet per student. So it's definitely worth looking at. And as you look at it, thinking about not just the physical footprint, but the carbon footprint together. And this is a great recent study in the National Academy of Sciences, looking at emissions reductions from working from home. And this isn't really even looking at embodied carbon, right? So this is just looking at what it takes to light, heat, and cool a space with fewer people in it, and the commuting as well, the transportation, the transit. 2 days a week, reducing by 11%. So space efficiency can also help universities hit their climate commitments.
Yeah, we've had customers making the case for 15 to 20% lower GHG emissions over the next 10, 15 years because they're baking in with utilization data. They can lower their total square footage for office space by 10 to 15 or 15 to 20% over the next 10 to 15 years as well. So there's even a lot more lower carbon footprint effect that can happen than just in that study, but that's a great study as well.
And I think we're gonna move on to the process for campus workplace change. But I'll just say we've got a couple of comments here. Yes, we'll be sharing the slides and of course the recording. And yes, very different approaches between academic and administrative workplace. I think my advice on academic workplace is wait 5 or 10 years, unless you're talking about clinical faculty or part-time faculty or folks who really are only there part of the time because they're teaching part-time or they're in the hospital and or in the lab or elsewhere. So I think most of as the SCUP benchmarking shows, people are much more likely to create workplace change for academic staff, who many are really looking for that flexibility. Like they're looking for the ability to work from anywhere, and are willing to think in terms of trade-offs, right? I get more flexibility, and in exchange, I won't have an assigned space.
Yeah, I'm really torn on that one. 95% of the pushback in implementing something like this will come from faculty spaces. And so I've advised customers to say, hey, just start with your administrative staff spaces. It's going to be way easier, prove out the ROI, and maybe down the road you can push it into faculty spaces. And I've had customers tell me, well, like, if we truly want to have more fair, more equitable space allocation, like how, faculty are not using their space any better than staff, oftentimes worse than staff. So if we want this to be fair, we have to do it for all space. And I hear that argument. I think that's very valid. But I will say from a pushback standpoint, 95% of the pushback will come from the faculty spaces.
Yeah, and it is certainly a balance. And I think, going back to those 3 waves of change, right? Smaller individual spaces, more open spaces, unassigned spaces. You can certainly start with right sizing faculty offices, and you could get much higher adoption of smaller offices than you can with shared spaces. So you could probably make progress more quickly on space efficiency and space utilization by right sizing the spaces themselves as opposed to trying to share them when you're talking about faculty.
Maybe.
Yeah.
And go ahead, Julie.
I was going to say, one thing I've heard from several clients, and I don't believe this has been implemented because it will be a difficult change, was to tie an assigned office for a faculty member to their compensation. So they would get greater compensation if they did not have an assigned office. I've heard this from several universities. Again, I have not seen it quite implemented yet, but I think the change is coming. It's going to take a while, but I think many universities are recognizing that they need to use faculty office space effectively, as well as all the other office space.
That's an interesting idea, Julie. I do think there's got to be some kind of carrot. We'll see. We have customers working on this now. I haven't heard that idea. I've heard some percentage of the savings maybe can go back into your budget. You can hire more grad students or some staff, or you get brand new furniture in your space. There's got to be some kind of incentive for the folks. And I think people are still trying to figure out exactly how that will work.
All right, Julie, do you want to take us through the process?
Great. Yeah. So, you've got this great data and you're seeing some trends and how it's being used. So how do you go about changing how you're allocating your space given that information? So one way is you can shift space allocation policy. So, the obvious kind of base of that is the one-to-one. So you've got one person is assigned to a desk. What we're seeing in a lot of universities is that when they're using that allocation policy, you walk in and even through the data or just from a visit, it's being very underutilized. There are people who come in, 2 days a week, 1 day a week, maybe they don't come in at all. They've still got a desk. It's still got all of their pictures and things. But what it also creates is an environment that is very, unengaging. It feels very empty. People who are coming into the office don't really want to come into the office to an empty space. So what one solution can be to you create work styles given using the data that you've harvested through the sensors, as well as other types of data like surveys and workshops. And those work styles can then be applied to those who are coming into the office, based on how many days a week. And adding more analytics into that is very important. I think that having multiple layers of data can give you the real picture of what change is going to work best. And that it also provides those who are in the offices who are going through the change a little bit more reassurance that you've really thoroughly kind of understood how the spaces are working and how these work styles can work best for those individuals. Moving from the one-to-one employee desk ratio with data, certainly data to me is the keystone. It's the truth. We'll talk about surveys, where certainly surveys are incredibly important. I think when people self-report how often they are in the office, it's quite different from what we see in the reality of the sensors. However, the surveys can really help with understanding how people work when they are in the office, so that you can then build those work styles based on how people do work. We can also use badge data, interviews with a lot of key stakeholders, and workshops with users to then again start to really gather how people are truly working and how you can form those work styles. So kind of a little bit of a sample here of the difference between maybe self-reporting how many days of the week you're in the office versus sensor data. Many universities are, I would say most that we have worked with, are having people self-report to a manager or to an HR person how many days a week they will be coming into the office. There are typically some guardrails there where they've set a policy where, yes, you work with your manager, you can come in 2 to 3 days a week. You maybe need to say, yes, I'm coming in Tuesday or Thursday. And then that data is then recorded by the university in some way. Most universities are not then going back and saying, well, we haven't seen you come in the days that you have self-reported, I think, and which is wise. I mean, that's probably not an effective way to manage. But we had, a university who did have this self-reported data of when people were coming in on the left, where they had 136 people. You can see that 56 people were coming in 2 days or less, which is a good majority of the spaces. 37 people were coming in 3 days, and then only 11 people were coming in 4 or more, and then they had a good portion of their spaces that were unoccupied. But then when you look at the right in terms of how often people were actually coming in, you can see that utilization is really low, that the people who are most likely saying they're coming in 2 or 3 days a week may or may not be actually coming into the office. So I think those two pieces are incredibly important to really look at in a combined way. We certainly don't want to take away from policies or the way people are kind of going about hybrid work. We know that hybrid work is very important, and how that is managed by the departments is very important. But the reality of how often people are coming in and how the space is being utilized is also incredibly important. So looking at these two pieces together can really give you a picture of how are the spaces currently being utilized and how do we need to program them for the future. If we don't want to change the graph on the left, then we need to make sure that the graph on the right changes by reorganizing the spaces. So how do you define work styles using multiple data inputs? So really work styles are, really kind of based on, how often is somebody in the office and how often are they at their desk and what type of work are they doing? Are they doing, a lot of heads down work? Is it collaborative, or is it more, or they're out on the campus and being very collaborative? And then you'll have an understanding of the time they're at the desk and then what they're doing while they're at their desk. So the interaction really informs the type of space that's needed. Again, collaborative, heads down, and then the mobility informs the amount of space that is needed. So, this then forms, you could have less than 6 work styles, or I would not advise doing more, but this is the typical arrangement of work styles that we will use to help people understand, how often they're at their desk and what that interaction or what that type of work is that they're doing while they're there. So again, a sample of how we used work styles and occupancy data to then really take a look at a workplace and how would we then structure that and how can we gain some space from that. So on the left, we had a head count of 80 people. There were 78 assigned workstations and 59 conference seats, and 1 collaboration seat. And it was in 17,600 assignable square feet. So using the occupancy data and the survey data, and then setting a bar of 3 days per week, will then, you will then be allocated an assigned seat. So, that is a very conservative approach. I think there was, availability to even go a little bit more aggressive on how many days per week in office would mean an allocated seat. But for this group, it felt like a good step in the change management process. So we were able to understand who, again, by the work styles, that 36 assigned workstations were truly needed for 80 people. We had 11 shared, 10 touchdown seats for people who are most likely campus mobile, and they're not often in the office. And then some quiet seats, which is definitely a concern in terms of many people who are either heads down or just need a quiet area. But then to really support this, we have much more medium and small collaboration spaces. One thing we've noticed, and we don't really have a data point on this, but it is consistent, is that large conference rooms are highly underutilized. And if they are being utilized, they are not anywhere near their capacity. So we've seen many 15 to 20 seat conference rooms being used by 2 to 3 people. Many times people don't have a way to get onto a Zoom call when they're in their space, so they're going to use a 10-person conference room in there by themselves. So we were able to work with this group and understand that they needed a lot more collaboration seats. So we were able to provide 26 seats, and that included phone booths, huddle rooms, and open collaboration areas. Phone booths, huddle rooms can also be used as workstations. So if, we often get asked the question, well, what if everybody were to come into the office on a day, which I would say, well, might not really ever happen. But if there is maybe more people there than the shared workspaces or touchdown spaces, the huddle rooms and the phone booths can absolutely serve as a workstation. So we were able to reduce this overall square footage by 5,600, which is really, I think not only is it achieving a great space savings, but it's also creating a work environment where it is far more engaging, where people are walking into the office and seeing a lot more people there. They're able to have more of those conversations that maybe they were only having via Zoom. So I think it's really important to note that the space savings absolutely has cost and sustainability wins, but I think that really creating a workspace that people want to be in and want to engage in, and when they are there, they feel like they're a part of their team, is also a real benefit to undergoing this exercise.
Yeah, I love that. Sorry to jump in, Julie. I love that case study. I love working with that customer together with you guys, and I think it really shows how we can provide data on the space, but OccuSpace does not have the expertise to do what you just are showing there. You really need people diving into the space, in the team, and what are the needs, and we can provide the data to make those decisions a lot easier. And I'm really excited to see that even with a 30% reduction in square footage there, we feel like that's still conservative. We feel like that's still going to be, more than enough space for that department. And then we're going to be able to monitor it post this change and be agile with how much space they have. If they are coming in more, then maybe they do need more space, but having data to kind of monitor that will be really exciting. That's a great case study.
Yeah, and you make a really important point where, the post-occupancy evaluation, which we do have some information about, is incredibly important. And it really goes into this slide of change process and change management. We really need to emphasize to people that we're not going to make this change and then you're going to be using that, for the next 10 years, to continue to monitor how this works through monitoring the occupancy data, continuing to conduct surveys, continuing to offer avenues of communication about how the workplace is working for everyone is very important and a pivotal part of the change management process. As it says here, I'm a big advocate of change management. I'm not a believer in if you build it, they will come. I think that you really need to work with your stakeholders, your constituents throughout the entire process so that they have a real understanding and confidence that the space is going to work for them. And they feel like they were a part of making this space. I've seen many times some failures where, a space is built and not a lot of change management happens. And, there's definitely not the utilization that we were hoping for. So training is really important with that. I think it really helps either at an individual or group basis to prepare people to make sure their change readiness is there so that they're ready to go into this space and use it to the best use and really enjoy it for it to be successful. In a flexible workplace program for the university, really the program resulted in a much higher success rate based on the change management program.
And there was a comment earlier about paper-based folks pushing back. And I think this is part of where the change management comes in. I think it was Roderick's comment earlier. In this example, this was an HR function. And part of how we measured the change management was in the tons of paper that was discarded. So that's part of the workplace storage discussion and some business process change around how you use paper. So, sometimes unavoidable and rightly dependent on it, but that's often something you can look at. And the assessment you do to understand the needs should also tell you about where your barriers to change readiness are so that you can then create the right program. If you see that paper is a big barrier, then you can target that. If you see that, I think quiet was the other thing, then, that's the importance of having the quiet room. Or, sometimes we see people are really nervous about it being a free-for-all. Where is my desk going to be today? And you can alleviate a lot of that by assigning people to a neighborhood as opposed to a desk, right? So you have consistency, you'll be with your team, and you'll get a space, and you don't have to worry about it being, showing up to the wrong building or not near your colleagues.
So, as part of change management, I think really creating norms and having cultural discussions as the software that makes the hardware work, again, is incredibly important. Spaces are used in new ways, even, pre and post pandemic. I think we're seeing a lot of change in how spaces are used. Obviously, Zoom is a huge change in how spaces are used. So really kind of having a lot of discussions, workshops, really, again, talking a lot about how people use space and creating those norms. Norms are incredibly important also to the noise factor. That is probably one of the most common questions that we get. And I think it's really a fear that people will go in and it will be too noisy and they aren't able to work. So kind of having a lot of conversations around what type of work are you doing? How can quiet areas be created? And then how do they work? I've been in places where the quiet zone is like the quiet car on the Amtrak train. If you went in and you were mistakenly loud, you got quite a few stares from some folks working there. And that's really, again, really kind of the almost grassroots way of making these changes happen and making sure that they're working. So as I said earlier, measuring the results is also incredibly important. You can then adjust those norms. You can adjust the operations. You can even adjust certain furniture or seat types, add more paper storage if needed, which usually we find it goes in the opposite direction. But really using a post-occupancy evaluation will tell you what do we need to adjust and change. And again, as part of the kind of building confidence for the users, having them engage in the surveys, sharing the information, sharing when there are changes to norms or culture, is again building confidence in the space that they're using. And and will lead to a much greater rate of success. In one project for the University of Michigan, I know the graph might be a little bit difficult to read, but really what you can see is that what I kind of take the high level read on it, that the darker green is where we saw that there were improvements on prior issues or items that were brought up. And only 2 at the bottom maybe needed to be adjusted. So the items that are kind of have the red text there were items that we kind of said, yeah, oh, good, thank you. I couldn't see it myself. But again, this is a way that you can use a post-occupancy evaluation to see where there are successes and where there are things that need to be adjusted or addressed, maybe from a cultural perspective, to kind of make sure that there's more success in the space. And then if you did take a quick step back there, there were some norms there that I've seen this used. It seems simple, but a lot of signage in the space, norms for the space. I mean, that's one that's still very heavily in use, reminding people of how to use things. And then elements in the design that don't support acoustic and visual privacy, things like glass or too many desks that are in an open area. Those again, you will kind of get your feedback on a post-occupancy evaluation and be able to then adjust those changes to then take care of those issues. I see a lot of questions in the chat here on this. I don't know if we want to keep going or.
I'm going to fly through these case studies in just a couple of minutes. We've got a lot of great questions. I want to get to these. And so I'll just show one customer. They did a survey of over, I think it was like 25,000 employees they had that were coming in every day or coming in to the office. It might have been a little less. That might be some of their other employee count. But they did a survey, and 72% of people that were coming into the office said they were coming in 4 or 5 days a week. They then deployed our sensors to almost every square foot of office space on campus, over 4 million square feet of office space. And then our data showed 24% of people were actually coming in 4 to 5 days a week or on average throughout the workday. So 3 times less than what's self-reported. So I think there's value in survey data. I think you shouldn't, take it for gospel, I guess. It's not always the most accurate stuff. Next case study. I want to show this is the most common decision that people make with our data today. This was a department on campus, an administrative staff department. They had 78 desks because they had 78 employees. They had a traditional 1-to-1 employee to desk ratio. Our sensors showed that only 8 people were coming in every day on average, with a peak of 19 people over the past year. The space planning department called up the head of that department and said, hey, if you guys want to continue to work hybrid remote, that's totally fine. And that's where we're kind of seeing hybrid remote work as like a tool to break away from 1-to-1 employee to desk ratios. So that's fine if you want to keep that, but you're going to lose some of your desks. You can't stay at 1-to-1 with 11% average utilization. So the department said, you know what, that's fine. We would prefer to continue to work remote and hybrid, and we'll give up those desks. So the space planning department said, all right, you're going to go down to 20 desks, about a 1-to-4 employee to desk ratio. You'll still have enough desks to handle your peak that you've seen in the last year in people. And we'll take that 14,000 square feet of space, 58 desks, and they then allocated that to 2 different departments, and they avoided leasing an additional 14,000 square feet of space, which was around 700K and almost 600 metric tons of CO2 a year avoided in heating and cooling that different space. So that's the most common decision we see. The next case study is very similar type decision with a little bit of different nuance. These were 2 buildings right next to each other. One department, I believe the police department in this case, was growing and coming in office every day, needed more space. The space planning team would traditionally then say, all right, we either need to build or lease more space. But then they noticed just the building right next to them had 61 desks and only about 18 people coming in every day. And so they actually just got those departments to switch space. It might not always work that cleanly. It did in this space, but the idea is that if you can spot the inefficiencies in your space, you can kind of shuffle things around and make your existing square footage fit your needs without having to add on to the square footage. And so that was a great case study we learned about recently. And then the last one I'll hit here is more on the dining side, just an interesting case study. A customer of ours, if this is actually the only corporate case study here, they're a Fortune 100 company. They're getting a 2-to-1 ROI on our data, measuring 2 of their buildings by just reducing food waste in the cafeteria. So by not throwing away so much food for lunch every day, they're getting a big ROI on our data just by we're able to tell them, hey, this is how many people are going to come to lunch every day by giving them some data on who's in the building, how many people are in the building. So that's a pretty cool case study, maybe a little bit less applicable to some of the folks in here. And let's jump into these questions. Elliot, you can decide if we want to go through another discussion topic or if we just want to start answering the questions in the chat.
Yeah, why don't we can come back to this if it'll help people spark maybe some of the concerns or barriers, and we can help them get over or around them. But I think we've got some good questions in the chat. I'll take one from the bottom here. Tiffany Hansen, a preferred POE survey. We have our own, and the reason we do that is we try and use the same survey before and after. So the needs assessment process, where we're asking people about what's working and what isn't, and how they're working and where they're working and how much time is spent where. And we're also asking about change readiness barriers, like talking about earlier, dependence on paper-based processes. You then follow up with that same survey 3 to 6 months after with, some of the questions you don't need, and maybe you add some new ones because about the goals of the project, which you didn't know before, because ultimately in a POE, you want to find out, did you meet your goals? But the short answer is we have our own, and we created it so that you can use the majority of it before and after and compare that pre and post.
And I saw a lot of questions at the top talking about kind of the space politics and the rollout and the communication for administrative staff and faculty spaces. I'll just want to point everybody to one of our customers that I think have done this extremely well in UC San Diego. They have a website. If you look up UCSD Live Density Program, that whole website is dedicated to the project that they have with us. They have a big FAQ, town hall, rollout, all kinds of different things in there. I think they've done a great job. You really want to over communicate with your staff and faculty about what's going on, why this is happening, why the university wants to do this, and what the potential outcomes can be. And probably the punchline of that is we generally, to do a project like this, you need chancellor, vice chancellor, finance and administration. You need support from the top because this is a very big change. And if you don't have that support, it might be hard to drive this kind of change. But I think with the financial implications and the savings that you can have by doing something like this, a lot of chancellors and CFOs will be supporting something like this. Let's start to run through some other questions, and Julie and Elliot, you can pop in and pick whatever ones.
There was one about Jay asked if we do mock-ups, and yes, that's absolutely part of the process. I think sometimes you can do a there are different kinds of mock-ups. There are different ways to prototype things. You can start obviously with like a rendering. Sometimes taping things out on the floor is very illuminating. People will be very surprised at how big 80 or 100 square feet can be. I know the new data science school at UVA that just opened this week has pretty compact offices, and they feel a lot bigger than the numbers would indicate. So sometimes you can do a very rough mock-up with taping it out. Sometimes you can use the white stuff that's like cardboard, foam board, I guess. I know that's not the right name, but yeah, and then you can go to a full mock-up with actual furniture, and furniture manufacturers can work with you on that.
Yeah, I would just say on that, there's a couple of different things. Like, we typically identify a group to be a full-on pilot, and very often there are willing participants. Typically, groups like IT are always, they're kind of the easy groups who are interested because of the way they work. So having a group that's actually willing to kind of work in the space and really understand it day after day is a great way to do a pilot. And then we've certainly done pilots where it's not just a workspace. You know, some of the smaller collaboration rooms, the phone booths that a lot of furniture providers have, they attract a ton of interest. People are very interested to know how they work. And they're almost always very successful. Again, the smaller meeting rooms or the phone booths. And that's a great way to help people understand that you're not going, you know, the goal, especially with the work styles, is if you have a work style where you're not heads down all the time, or you're on a lot of Zoom calls or whatever that might be, getting to understand these other spaces is just as important as understanding your workspace.
I think we also had a question from Marianne about kind of where librarians might fit between the academic and administrative spectrum in terms of changing from having an assigned workspace to shared workspace. And I think it is true that, you know, on many campuses, librarians have faculty appointments. So it is in that kind of gray area where, depending on the role, it may make sense or it may be possible. But like with anything, it's looking at how the space is actually used, and considering it holistically and thinking about what are the trade-offs. I think one thing that we've certainly observed in libraries is that the people who tend to get offices tend to be the ones that are working most likely to work remotely. So subject librarians, subject liaisons, subject specialists, who are often the ones most likely to get an office so that they can consult with people or do heads down work, are the least likely to be on campus and are doing most of those consultations by Zoom anyhow. So I think from a functional point of view, often quite possible to do that in a phone booth, in a meeting room, from home, wherever.
At the top, I saw a lot of people picking 4 and 5 on the previous discussion slide, which was consolidating space and going to shared unassigned desks. And I think those things are so connected. And maybe like a shameless plug, but I think having utilization data is so important to drive that change. If you go to a department and you say, hey, you have 80 desks, we want to make you go to unassigned seating. How many desks do you think you need? They're going to be like, oh, like 80 desks. Or it's going to be very hard to figure that out without data. But when you have data, the EVC of UC San Diego put it so well. She said, this data is not going to be used to determine the answers of what we're going to do. It's going to be used to ask the right questions. And so you can take data of, hey, you have 78 desks, but only 8 people show up every day. You can approach it and say to that department head and say, let's figure out a solution here so that we can be more efficient as a university with all of our resources. And it's just harder to deny it when you have data, and they're going to be a lot more open to saying, all right, we can actually go to a shared workspace and consolidate space, and this is going to be better for everybody. Where if you don't have that data, it's a lot easier for there to be friction there, because they can deny that they don't need all the space they have.
Yeah, and I'll also say, like, part of the key here is how you bring different data sources together, right? So you could have sensor data, you could have badge swipe data, you could have survey data, and extrapolating and interpolating among those different data sets can really be helpful. And then you can do those comparisons, right? If the survey is 3 times the occupancy of the sensor, well, then you know how to perhaps extrapolate from other survey data where you don't have sensor data, at least conservatively.
And Melissa, I see a question. Can the sensors be redeployed after surveys and move them to another area? Yes, they can be. There's some additional costs with moving these sensors around, but I'd say the jury's still out on how effective this strategy will be. I think it will be effective to a point. What we're seeing in some cases with customers who have done this is 3 months later, like how we use space is agile. It's changing pretty quickly, especially right now. 3 months after you pull the sensors out, somebody goes back and says, hey, now we're actually in office all the time and we need this space back. And so some of our customers like UCSD are kind of moving towards this quarterly or annual space allocation based on data, kind of like budget. It's use it or lose it. And by having the data all the time, they can continue to stand on firm ground when they say this is how many desks you really need.
And I'll just quickly say, Amber just asked about a trend moving toward hoteling offices and workstations. Yes, that's absolutely what we're seeing and saying here when we talk about shared spaces. A lot of times people have an aversion to that term, hoteling, so we try not to use it. I think it's in part because people are worried about that free-for-all of, will I get a desk? Where will it be? But if you're actually assigned to a neighborhood, not a desk or an office, and in that neighborhood there's lots of different places to work, then it's much more doable and palatable. And as to the best way to book that, I think there are lots of systems out there, but one thing that we find is that's often a function of a platform you're already using. Like you may have a CAFM system to manage the space that has a space booking module. So the first place I would look is what you already have, as opposed to trying to do a new system that then you have to integrate. And I think when you're assigning people to a neighborhood, that's also helpful because there's a lot of misconceptions about shared space. When you say like a shared office, people imagine, oh, okay, I'll use it Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then my colleague will use it Thursday and Friday. That's generally a terrible idea because the idea that your schedules will perfectly interlock is pretty unrealistic. But if people are sharing a pool of space, if 12 people are sharing 8 spaces, that's much more likely, and then you don't have to have the space drive the schedule.
And kind of tied to that is Nancy's question here, which might be the last one we get to. When an entire department's in for 2 days a week, but it's all the same day, what's the strategy? I literally just met with a customer that's going through this, and I'm really excited to see what happens. And actually, I'm at OccuSpace, we're going through this. We want to come into the office 1 or 2 days a week, but I don't want to pay for an office where I'm only using it 1 or 2 days a week. I'm actually looking for another company here in Austin that we can both lease a space together, and we can agree what days we both want to come in. And that's kind of what we're seeing this customer do, is they're saying, all right, if department A is going to come in on Mondays and Wednesdays, can we find another department that wants to come in on Tuesdays and Thursdays? And they kind of both share these spaces. And there's some complexities with that, of course, but I do think that's a really interesting scenario. I think we're going to see more of that, of different departments kind of sharing the same spaces on different days of the week. I'll keep you posted if we get a good case study for that, because that would be really, really great.
Yeah, and I'll just add that hybrid work is more of a challenge about time than it is about space. And meetings are often what drive occupancy. So if you're trying to spread the use out more evenly over the week, you might want to have some days that are in common. But what you can do is go with different departments, and maybe they each have like a big weekly stand-up meeting or some big weekly gathering. And if they're all not on the same day, that can be a way to kind of spread the usage out, as opposed to like everybody doing theirs on Monday.
Definitely. Well, I think we're at time. Wish we could get to all the questions and dive into this more. Maybe we'll have a future session again. But appreciate everybody for joining. We'll follow up with a link to this video and the presentation as well. But enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Thank you for coming in.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.